TNKR Media.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
So today we'll be speaking with Phillip J. Fournier. He's a physics professor at a CEGEP, a junior college here in Montreal, and he's a poll aggregator. He has a website called QC125.com, Quebec125.com, and he takes all of these polls and makes predictions. And he is someone who is not loved by the polling industry, although perhaps in France, maybe trusting someone like Philippe will give you a more accurate, closer portrayal of what the electorate wants than just any individual poll.
Well, let's see it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? After all, if he aggregates a bunch of garbage, garbage in, garbage out, then it's like you just have a bigger mass of garbage, right?
All right, let's see what his methodology is on the Goldwaters.
Polls play a large part in how we talk about politics. They set the agenda for political discussion, measure the horse race. And some say polls can be bad for democracy, and they take too much focus away from policy. On the other hand, polling is one method. We have to look at a snapshot in time and judge the public mood. So, Philippe, with all the, recently there's been a lot of negative talk about polling in the news, and it's just, there's poll after poll after poll being presented. But before we get into any of the negatives, what have polls actually brought us in terms of, just in general, in terms of politics? Why do we do these?
You mean a scientific measure of public opinion, right? Because that's what a poll is. If it's done right, this is a way to ask for a second opinion. Politicians all the time are on the field all the time, hiring polling firms to do polls for them, and basically not only the horse race, but just getting a second opinion from the public. So if polls are done wrongly, like anything else, they can be a really bad influence. But scientific polls that are done rightly with the right weighting, a good sample size of a population, I think can be a very instructive measure of public opinion. So those who don't like polls often, in my personal experience, know nothing about polls. Right? And they know nothing about polling or think, the polling is basically biased and is a way to influence the electorate. I do not believe that, and that is based on several university research that has been done in sociology and political science over the years that show that polls don't really influence. Have you ever heard someone say, I saw this poll, so I decided to vote for this party? Doesn't happen a lot, maybe a little bit.
Well, then let me ask you something. So, Philippe, sell this to me. Sell this scientific representation. So, what good have polls actually done? Can you give me a tangible example of where politicians, let's say, have taken the public pulse and had a really good poll, and that this has had a positive impact?
It's knowledge. It's there. It's like studying nature. I'm an astrophysicist. What is it good for? Why do we study stars and study planets and study stellar atmospheres? It's meaningless in the grand scheme of things, like everything else, basically. But what good are polls? It's like it's studying society. And so if some people do not like polls, again, maybe they don't realize that it's just studying society. So
I want to fight with you, Philippe.
Oh.
I'm hot. I'm anxious.
Was not ready for that, but okay, sure.
Okay. You're an astrophysicist.
Yes, I am.
You infer a lot of natural phenomena by indirect observations, correct?
I don't think collecting photons on a disk made to analyze infrared and ultraviolet light. I don't think that's... go ahead.
They're indirect observations. You're trying to make it sound reductionist, but it isn't. I'm not talking taking a snapshot. You'll infer the existence of phenomena by taking measurements that permit you to infer the presence, let's say, of a black hole, right? You're not directly making an observation by taking a photo, as you're implying.
What is direct observation?
A photo.
I'm going to give you. It's photons getting into your eyeballs.
Well,
right.
And
then,
being turned upside down in your brain.
Yes, and then electrical signals going to your brain. The
Right,
telescope
but
does
now
the same
again,
thing.
you're doing a debater's trick by being overly reductionist. I'm saying there are, and you know that, you know very well there are phenomena as an astrophysicist that you have to observe that are beyond the tools evolution has given us to observe our local environment. But there are phenomena you need to observe and you need to understand, like the event horizon, that you can't see directly using your own eyes, and you're using statistical sampling, in fact. And the reason I'm saying this right away is because I really think, and this is my hypothesis, that the sampling that we call polls is finished because we've had observer effect. I think that if it were 100 years ago, plain polls where you telephone someone or meet someone in the street and take a random sample and do demographic adjustments and ask someone a political opinion are finished. The observer effect has invalidated this as a scientific method to get those numbers. I think you have to start using other methods, probably derived from AI, to infer opinions from other observed traits that the observed person cannot deliberately distort, like poor Schrodinger's cat. See, for me, it all comes back to Schrodinger's cat.
Well, this is exactly why you need aggregators. Because if you give too much importance to a single poll, you will see more noise than signal. You will see more noise than data. And what you said about the sample size, well, I am a scientist, so I go with results. And let's say the example of Quebec, we'll take what I know best. In the last 20 years, the polls have been really good. Elections after election. After years, the polls have been really good. Of course, some polls were wrong, but if you take them together and you average them out and you use my calculations to have a weighted average of where public opinion goes, when the election arrives, it's always within the margin of error. 2014, 2012, 2008, 2007, 2003, 1998, they were all right. So at some point, even if you doubt the sampling of polls, well, that's why we need more than a polling firm, and that's why we need more than one method to measure the polls.
But if you're saying one poll can generate noise and not validate it, what difference does it make if you weight a lot of noise?
It's like rolling on a Montreal road without suspension in your car. You will have a lot of noise, right? But with a suspension, you will amortir the noise, right? And so what you said, it's not all noise. There's signal in there. But let's say from one month to another, like last month, in April, we had Main Street that said the Liberals and the CAQ were tied. And then a few weeks later, we had Ipsos that said the CAQ had 3 points ahead of the Liberals. So did they jump 3 points? No, it's just two ensembles. It's two pieces of a gigantic puzzles that you have to put together. If you take them individually, they will be wrong. But if you take them together, it's like a puzzle.
But you see, I'll tell you why I don't buy it seriously. I think there's confirmation bias in there because you're pointing out that it's aggregating with your methodology to do the weighting. And for people who don't know politics in Quebec, you are so lucky. We have like about 172 parties at any given time. So the differences in popularity from one party to another are often a rounding error. And by 172, I mean 4 serious parties. And as a result, the differences are not big to begin with. So if you take a whole bunch of polls and you just take the average, you're weighting the probability that you're going to be right without necessarily having generated any particularly valid data. We're all generally divided between federalists and separatists, and right? The only thing actually that's scary is the rise of the CAQ. And now you guys are saying the CAQ is going to win. You say the CAQ is going to win?
That's not at all what I said,
No?
Maître Goldwater, or Anne France again, sorry.
Yes, Anne France.
That's not at all what I said. I said a snapshot right now, according to the data we have right now, the CAQ is the most likely party to win. We don't know by how much. And if you take my previous projection that I published in L'Actualité, the Liberals still win about 12% of my simulations. So it's possible. And if you take the model, let's say, of Nate Silver's 538 in the States, he had a 1 out of 3 chance that Trump would win.
28%. 28.6%.
So almost 1/3, right? 1/3 is the throw of a dice, and you choose, let's say, 5 or 6, and you throw it as 5 or 6 Trump wins. It happens. But so that's why I weighed the probabilities of all 125 writings. And then taken together, you can have a reasonable probability of who's going to win.
So you're coming here to profess a continued confidence in polling results, even though aggregators in the history of American politics, going back to Truman and Dewey, have consistently predicted, been wrong. Well, it wasn't an aggregator in that election, in fact, to be fair. But they get it wrong more often than they get it right in the States.
That is not true. Well, if you take the good ones, Nate Silver had 50 out of 50 in 2008, and it had 49 out of 50 in 2012. I think it's pretty good.
Oh, no, that's at the state level. That's garbage. See, again, you're not thinking that at the state level, you're comparing a more homogeneous population, like in Quebec, where within a province or within a state, you can get better results because your sample's not too big. There's less adjustment to do, so you're less likely to get it wrong. Sort of by accident.
Yeah, but it's the addition, it's the sum of the states that makes the president. That's what the elections is in the US,
then
right?
the mistakes add up.
Of
the
course.
mistakes become proportionally more and more important
Of course.
as you move from 5 million people to 300 million people, right?
Nope, that's not true.
Well, let me
That's
ask.
not true. You can have a poll in the U.S. of the population 300 million, and you have a poll of 2,000 people. The margin of error will be about 3%. So yes.
Well, then let me ask you then, Philippe, because there's, I guess there's the two sides of it, which is, if you take a bunch of data points together, you take a bunch of different studies together, and you put them all together. If they're all crappy studies, then I imagine you're just going to have a much bigger load of crap. But if they all have some validity to it, then theoretically you're going to be getting more precise findings the more you're putting things together. So how do you determine the difference? Because it seems like, as far as I understand, that's where you guys are meeting, are
fighting.
arguing.
I view it as garbage in, garbage out.
Maybe it's semantics, but there's a difference between bias and noise.
Right.
Noise cancels out. Bias, it's, let's say, all the posters on the field in Quebec, it's Crop and Léger and all these guys, if they have a bias that in their sample they're oversampling the CAQ, well, they will be wrong. Of course they will be wrong. But historically, that has not been the case. Historically, what we have is the polls are pretty good, and the Liberals are always a bit underestimated. Not by much, but always a bit underestimated. Mm-hmm. The famous Bourassa prime à l'urne, right? Mm-hmm. The ballot box bonus, that's always on the side of the Liberals. It's never that big, but it's always 1 point or 1.5 points. So by taking those polls together, I'm reducing the noise. But I can't do anything about the bias. If they're all biased on the same side, I will miss it.
I like that distinction. I think that's a really important one to bring up, bias versus noise, because even in psychology we talk a lot about meta-analyses, which seem to be quite similar to what you're talking about in terms of aggregate. It's another method of aggregating data. And if you have and a meta-analysis essentially is just you take a bunch of studies of a given phenomenon and you have some criteria in terms of what makes them valid. You put them all together and then you determine how big the real effect is and if it actually exists or not. And the thought is, and let's go with that if these are valid studies, that any one may not be, maybe, let's say, statistically non-significant, but if you put them all together, then you can start to wash out some of the noise and see what's actually there. But to your point, if the studies that you're looking at in the meta-analysis, or the studies that you're aggregating in
aggregating
in terms of polls, if they're consistently biased, then you're just summarizing a whole bunch of bias.
Yes.
But it's more than bias. It's methodology that's a problem. As I happened, just yesterday, I was reading a meta-analysis of 25 studies of the empirical validity of psychodramas, a form of psychotherapy, right? And when I actually looked at the studies that were being analyzed, the studies themselves were garbage, old, and not scientifically validated. And I'm not talking about the general crisis in replication of studies in sociology and psychology. I'm talking supposedly a valid meta-analysis. I'm thinking, well, if you're meta-analyzing 25 garbage studies, you're still learning nothing. Because the sum of a bunch of zeros, 25 zeros, still add up to zero. And apropos what you're saying, Philippe, I still don't see how you can distinguish so readily bias from noise without bringing in your own bias, whether it's a confirmation bias or the anti-confirmation bias. It used to be a big deal in sociology to do studies about people's sexual practices. And I used to laugh.
Yeah.
Well, sexual belief and practice is kind of the same as political.
How do you quantify that, though? It's much harder to quantify than just who you're going to vote for, or what party do you lean towards. So,
well, considering I won't make the obvious scatological comparison between sexual practice and what politicians do to you, but I think they're both very intimate belief systems and actions, the most intimate, right? But that being said, you knew in advance that the results of polls would be different, whether they were commissioned by Good Housekeeping or by Playboy or Psychology Today or any other magazine in between. Not that they weren't hiring independent polling agencies, but there is so much subjectivity in the crafting of the studies. I laugh because I get a lot of calls from polling agencies for federal politics, federal Canadian politics. And they're very, very earnest people who are trying to get my opinion. And I find one of the things that I note is quite clever is now one of the initial question is, are you interested in the topic of the Kinder Morgan pipeline? Are you interested in the topic of the renegotiation of NAFTA? And I thought, well, that's a clever question, because if you just ask somebody to give an opinion, most people are going to make up an opinion without having any clue what they're talking about, which is how most people vote to begin with.
Well, I like what you're bringing up here, and I think this is going to bring about an important nuance. What is the difference between a good poll and a bad poll? Like, what are the common, because there's a lot of polls being presented. And as the public, we're being inundated with this data. And we don't necessarily know, if you're not a statistician, if you're not a pollster, you don't necessarily know the difference to be able to tell. So what are the issues that we should be looking out for?
Well, I focus mostly on a horse race and the satisfaction of the government. So I don't play outside of what I know. Basically, I'm very careful not to tread on this ground. Listen, again, I'm an empiricist. I'm an astrophysicist. I see noise inside data, but the data is still there. We have to root it out. So what makes a bad poll? Well, maybe let's say you look at the history of the polling firm. If they're always wrong, at some point you have to stop using that data. Again, I go with the results. Basically, when I build my model, to test it, I used previous data. I went back to the 2014, 2012 election, 2008 election too, and I took only the data that was available then, so the census data for the demographics. I used the polling during the election campaign, and I was always within the margin of error. So for the 2014 election, the Liberals won 70 seats, and with my model, I would have predicted 67. I think that's pretty good. So again, I go with the results. If it works, well, I could be wrong. And if I am, I will try to explain. There's a story there. I will try to explain why I was wrong, and maybe some regions were outliers. But, we went from a PQ minority in 2012 to a Liberal majority in 2014, and only about 30 ridings changed colors.
Okay.
So I have to focus on those, maybe. I will make you a prediction right now. I'll bet my mortgage on it that the West Island will be red. There you go. So we know that.
Deep thoughts by Philippe.
There you go. But that's the easy part. Then you have to go look at the Mauricie, and then you have to look at the Quebec City region, which they never re-elect the same people. They always switch. The Liberals do well in Quebec City. The CAQ will do well too, and they oscillate from one to the other. Now I have to again see what's going on in there.
But you're giving observations that are so subjective. Like, you make me so excited. You see, you know things because...
Is that positive?
I don't know. It's positive to me because it makes me jump up and down in my seat. Right. But you see, you know about which is why I was joking before about Quebec politics, as we love switching political parties. We switch them like a pair of pants on the French-Canadian side. Yeah.
We do?
The Anglo side, we sit there and we shiver in fear and we vote the closest Federalist party that doesn't stink too hot, right? But on the other side, it's constant switches. You realize it could have been just as easily Quebec Solidaire that would have been hot today as the CAQ.
No, Quebec Solidaire?
Because it's a French cultural phenomenon to constantly change political parties. So I hear you, but you see, you're bringing in a subjective element of observation in a local political environment.
I'm bringing up data from past elections. That's not subjective opinion.
You see, you're pretending to make it objective and boy-like, but I'm speaking like a girl and realizing that it's intuitive observation by being inside a culture. Could you seriously have believed for a moment, looking at the population of the United States in a large way, to the extent you can look at 300 million people, and have believed for a moment that the American population would have voted into power an autocratic leader closer to Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Mao than anything that resembles a democratic president.
The data showed so.
The data showed so.
The data showed so.
So you view this data actually divorced from the people and the reality of what they think and feel.
There was a very interesting study by Dr. Claire Durand, University of Montreal. So she's the president of WAPOR, a World Association of Public Opinion Research. And basically, do polls influence elections?
Right.
Right? And the conclusion of their study, a long study, I'm not going to cite the whole thing, but basically it was very little, because very little people are actually that motivated. It will motivate the nerds in us, the political nerds in us. But the general population, as we referred them to earlier, do not pay that much attention. And a lot of people just vote for what they are, right? We're liberals, we're Péquistes, and very few people will actually swing from one party to another, from election to election. So do they influence election? They influence maybe the narrative, but I don't think they influence it directly, because they describe the narrative. So I don't know. If we take the situation right, this spring, this summer, that the CEQ has a slim lead over the Liberals and the PQ is just disintegrated right now. They're just,
Thank God.
Well,
Baruch Hashem, as we say in French.
The Parti Québécois could be reduced to 6 or 7 seats right now with those numbers. But campaigns matter. When a lot of people actually follow politics, when it's on the news every single day for about 35 to 45 days, this is when public opinion switches. We just had a recent example in Ontario last month, right? So we had the Conservative who had 25 to 30 point leads in many polls, and then suddenly the election started, the campaign started, and people started paying attention. And we had the first debate where Doug Ford, didn't do really well. And suddenly what happened? A lot of Liberal voters went to the NDP, and the Progressive Conservatives just slowly went down from 45 to 42 to 40, and they ended up around 39. So
but
outside of campaigns, numbers don't change that much, because people don't pay attention.
Look, it sounds counterintuitive, and that's okay, because science teaches us many things that we thought were counterintuitive and turned out to be okay. But you cannot tell me that it had no impact in the United States, the proliferation of polls that assured us that Hillary Clinton would win, notwithstanding her personal unpopularity, but that she would win. And I firmly believe it discouraged many people from going out and voting, because they thought it was a sure thing. I think when you feel you're the underdog, you make a greater effort to go out and vote.
That's not the polls' fault.
Sure, it's the constant publication of the polls that influences the campaign.
Hey, if knowledge is out there, and what people do with it is not the fault of knowledge, it's the fault of people, right?
Well,
you blame people for not going to vote when, so, I mean...
It's assuming that the knowledge is accurate.
Well, it was.
Course. And
the
so,
U.S. election, I'm sorry, I know it's a widespread opinion that polls stank during the U.S. election. They were pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah, but you can't exculpate the pollsters. You cannot fail to consider what that knowledge can create. If you remember, the publishers of the writers of the book, the authors of the book, The Bell Curve, were pilloried forever after by sociologists by talking about difference in academic results and IQ between different racial groups in the United States without taking into consideration the huge harm that could be caused. And we recently obtained, on a very confidential basis, I won't say from whom, database information from a major, I have to say it without identifying them, employment software database company, about how to analyze prospective employees. And in this very confidential information they don't give out, and we signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, they talk about how different racial and cultural groups perform differently on job interviews and job testing, which often measure IQ, or G, at least general intelligence. So some knowledge can be very toxic. And you have to consider that. I find your whitewashing poll results good or bad.
If you're asking me to defend all polls, I won't do it because it's not what I do, and I agree. If you're asking me if there are garbage polls out there, of course there are, right? But political horse races are much easier to pin down. It's much easier to quantify, and since there are, in Quebec at least, not a lot of firms, maybe 4 or 5 firms, we can weed out the bad ones. A polling firm that has consistently bad results will lose a lot of money.
Like who?
Well, they don't exist anymore, right?
Oh, okay.
Exactly. But that's why polling firms are on the field measuring public opinion for newspapers that don't really pay much for the polls. It's because that if, let's say, they pin it down to the percentage point, well, then they will maybe get contracts from private companies. It's always it's a way to have a free publicity, basically. So it's not free, but it's out there. And let's say Main Street research is trying to gain ground in Quebec. It's doing really well in English Canada. And last year they decided they were going to try to gain the Quebec electorate, and they did telephone polls, good old fashioned telephone polls, right? And they gave them away to Post Media. But a telephone poll of 1,500 people cost about $12,000. So why would they spend that much money? Well, they spend that much money to have their name printed in a newspaper and people talk about it on the radio all day. And those polls showed pretty much the same tendencies as Léger. And now they switched back to IVR, which automated calls, basically. It's much more, it's much less expensive now. But I'm glad to have a second source because otherwise Léger would have basically the field for itself. And the differences between the polling firms are interesting too. Some have a few. There's a house effect, we call it. Some are a little more liberal, a little more pickiest, and it's not intentional, but it's out there, and that's why you need sites like mine. So what you said earlier about the American election, there were garbage polls, of course, but if you take them together and you average them out, and you grade the agencies and you grade the polling method, well, you can have interesting results. So again, just to go back to that election, Miss Clinton won the popular vote by 2.8 million votes. And that was pretty much what the national polls in the U.S. said. And Mr. Trump won Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those 3 states. The margin of votes that he won, if you add them up, it's less than the population of Trois-Rivières in a country of 300 million.
It's Trois-Rivières' fault?
There you go.
My God.
So less than 100,000 votes out of 300 million people.
But I guess, and it's something that's actually quite important to me, is to be able to, at times recognize that, if I don't have the information, then I don't need to have an opinion about it. And I think that that's something that you guys were mentioning before, and as an issue in polls, and as Mom, as you were mentioning, is that a lot of times in the polls, when you're asked for your opinion, even if you don't have a particular opinion about it, you'll just kind of come up with one based on the stuff that you know. And
the general desire to be socially pleasing and not to appear stupid. I think a lot of people answer polls that way, and they pretend to care.
That's why automated calls usually have better results in there, because people are less afraid to tell their opinion to a machine instead of to a live human being at the other end of the line. So automated calls did really well with Trump versus Clinton.
And I like, Philippe, where you're going with this is that it's just to leave it as, the data will speak for itself. And so if it's accurate, it's accurate.
There you go.
Okay, great. If it's not, okay, do something else or find some other data sources. And that putting, a bunch of different polls together is going to give potentially more valid results than taking any one of them individually. But let's go beyond politics at a certain point here. So we now have access to oceans and streams of data, and everything's being measured in real time and available in almost an instant. Big data is definitely here to stay. But what does that mean? Like, are statistics and big data the way forward in terms of better policy making? Because for now we're using polls, and Mom, you're mentioning a lot of potential issues with that. And so where's the future? Take out your crystal ball. Big data is here; it's just increasing. How do we use that going forward?
Well, there are market researchers for anything, for orange juice, for telephones, for vacations, for airlines, right? And so again, to ask the public their opinion and to try to quantify it to improve services and products, I think can only be good. but you're also giving away maybe private information, and so maybe the age of secrecy is over because of that. But you know, you go ahead.
Yeah, of course, the age of secrecy is over, and that's absolutely fine, because I don't know how you're giving away anything real about your private life when you're a single datum in a database that may contain 100 million people, 500 million people, 1 billion people, if you look at the size of Facebook's clientele. But of course, it's the era of big data, but I'm hoping this is going to bring, because there's neutral observers being computers.
Computers are not neutral observers. They do what we tell them to do.
They do it, yeah, but we can instruct them to find correlations, not causation, but correlations between different data points. Like the whole notion, for instance, that if you take a large enough sample of white human faces, I think we're taken from a dating site, you can predict whether the person is gay or straight, or the computer can do it, with absolute neutrality, because the computer doesn't care. The computer attaches no value judgment. The computer's not interested in having sex with any of the faces or the bodies.
Have you asked the computer?
For now.
Yeah, for now. That's coming soon. Yes, we think of the movie
pun intended.
AI,
Yeah,
pun intended. And it would appear that these computers have better gaydar than I do, because in fact humans, despite their beliefs that they can, while cruising someone in a bar, figure out whether they're approaching someone gay or straight, and do it well. The truth is we can do it barely better than chance, so we often hit on people of the wrong sexual persuasion, sometimes the wrong sex, in fact, whereas computers get it straight, but they're observing all kinds of strange data points that we wouldn't think of observing: jaw size, nose size.
We could if we had the time, but that's the same reason why a human being will never ever win at chess ever again against a computer. It's never going to happen ever again, because a computer can predict a chess move like 25 moves ahead, and that kind of calculations would take more than a lifetime for a human being. So if
we can't hold, even if we could conceive of them, we couldn't hold them all in our head at once.
But that machine that recognizes gay faces or straight faces was programmed by humans. So we can tell the computer, try this and try that. But the computing itself.
But isn't that the whole point of AI, which is that you take the database, you say what you know about the database, because remember, these are people who self-identified as gay or straight,
right.
And then you instruct the computer to observe, so to speak, without consciousness, without sentience.
Without context.
And without context, but knowing the data are valid according to the self-report of the person, to look, to observe at everything: ear size, eye color, whether the person's wearing a tie or a necklace, and put that all together. And with a large enough database, you start finding correlations. Again, they have nothing to do with causation, and there's no moral judgment. But they can start saying, might come up with observations, as they did, for example, that people wearing baseball caps are more likely to be gay than straight in both sexes. Which tells
you still have to. But to Philippe's point is that there's still a human that is developing that AI software and that is determining what relationships to look at. So even in the study that you're referencing now, in terms of identifying a sexual orientation based on faces, based on this dating site, there's a lot of assumptions that are put in there already by the humans. The humans that actually looked at this relationship. If you look at actually the dating sites, people did not actually identify as gay or straight. It was just who they were looking to stop. And so even when you're now quoting the findings, the people in that study, in that site, when they were looking at the actual subjects in there, they didn't identify as gay or straight. They just said who they were interested in being amorous with. Identity is also different than behavior, and there's a whole bunch of social science research delving into that. But when you're actually looking at the relationships and then drawing the conclusions and saying, okay, people's faces predict their sexual orientation, that's assuming that's putting the researcher bias that there may be this relationship between, or that there's this close relationship between the sexual behavior and orientation. That's not something the AI came up with. That's something that...
And if I may,
yes.
Also, it's not mentioned very often, because we just think that those programmers managed to build the software that does this. But how was it built, really? It was trial and error. Basically, that's what it was. Same for my political model. It's trial and error. I look at what works. So basically, this guy took this database of people on dating sites, and he played around with the variables until he could make it work. So it's trial and errors. You have to remember that. What works, it has to work at the end.
Okay, but if I'm going to hit up the bars and I want to know what works, because I too I am really an empiricist. That being said, it tells me the composite straight and the composite gay face tell me like whom to approach in a vague and generalized way that if my parents were responsible, would have taught me when I was a little girl that if you want this type of action, you aim for this face.
Let's just mention that it's not perfect, right? It's, what is it, 80% that result?
Yeah, so that's a good start.
It's a good start.
I think it was 80% for men and around 70% for women.
Yes, so 4 to 5. So that's good, but there are always exceptions.
Unless you run into that 1 out of 5 person who's not too thrilled with being presented with your solicitation.
Well, again, if I don't want to go back always to my model, but it's the difference between an opinion and an informed opinion. That's what polls and well-made polls, well-sampled polls provide. They provide better information. It's not perfect, like that model. If pure chance, say you're straight, you're gay, you're straight, if you have a taux de réussite 50%, well, that means that it's just luck of chance. If that machine goes 80%, well, it's not perfect, it's just a little better.
Well, hold on. But humans tend to make a lot more mistakes. Apparently, our ability on the average to guess runs in the 50s, like whatever, 51, 52 to about 60%. Once it's 80%, saying, damn, I can develop a dating strategy based on these data in a non-harmful way. What was more worrisome, however, is when people start using because we're still talking about something pleasant and benign, which is, after all, we're talking about assortative mating and whom we're going to approach.
Spooch.
Stuff, yeah. Who you want to stuff.
God, you've learned something so good. I'm so impressed. And it's, And
is that a swear word, though? Can I say that in front of my parents?
You can say
your
stuff
parents
in front of your parents.
that's how you were born. You kind of resemble
It's not derogatory. It's not a swear.
It's not derogatory. Although, then again, everything in Yiddish is a little bit, colorful. So, but, becomes more worrisome when you find that, for instance, that Facebook's ad buying system had enabled advertisers who are paying them to target advertising messages at people with interests such as how to burn Jews and why Jews ruin the world. I was trying to figure what flamethrowers, concentration camp builders.
You didn't know that we're flame retardant?
So obviously can be used for evil, as can any data. That I agree with you is not the fault of the data.
Yeah, I know.
But, although it does indicate that for the aggregators of super big data like Facebook and other social media, there might be an argument to be made for a certain degree of government regulation because they do possess pernicious knowledge that permits evil to be propagated.
Well, splitting the atom really helped us as humans, but it also created the atomic bomb, right? So it's what we do with it. It's what we do with the knowledge.
Right, and that's the problem. You see, I'm of the school of thought that I believe you can never prevent the knowledge from existing and being amassed. And I do agree with you that it depends on the good you choose to do with the knowledge that you're creating. Like I always thought when I was reading the bell curve that it could be useful to know that there are populations that have different academic performance so that governments could target educational programs to help disadvantaged communities without judgment. But of course, that's never what happens. People will often use big data from big samples, because the bell curve was reporting on a huge longitudinal study that had a tremendous sample size in order to cause harm, in order to judge different communities by academic performance, and that's evil. It's terrible. But you see, if you'll forgive me, Samantha, I have to come back to the one thing. How can we prevent democracy from being perverted and twisted as it is so that evil people have better access to data that permits them to twist the will of the people and permits autocratic leaders to come into power, as opposed to people who actually believe the values
so
of democracy.
Let's go back to, Philippe, your original distinction between noise and bias. Yeah. And so there's plenty of, of course, all the polls that you're using are not at all biased. There's just a bit of noise in there, and you wash that out, and everything comes out squeaky clean. But we know that there's other bad people that have biased polls and have certain interests in terms of presenting them. So let's say I wouldn't put, not to name names, I wouldn't put too much weight on a Fox News poll, let's say, of what the current political climate is. And so what do you do to, to mitigate for that, to mitigate for people that are using, and especially as the public, because when you see numbers, it seems valid. When we look at something and we see percentage points and we see a research study was done, then it adds
a graph, especially a graph.
Oh yeah, graphs are great.
Interactive graphs do it much better. Yeah.
And they don't know how to read graphs. Yeah. People cannot read graphs to save their lives. They all went through high school.
Don't forget that I'm also a teacher, right? So that's one of my objectives as when I started Quebec 125 was to teach how to read polls. So I'm trying to make it a little better.
So let me ask you that in terms of reading polls and identifying bias. So if I'm watching the news and I see a poll is being presented, and if, let's say, there's some intent to switch my, to change my mind, to influence my vote based on the people that are being polled and the method that's being used, how do I know that? How can I distinguish that when I'm watching it? How can I not fall victim to being manipulated in this way?
Well, you can't be 100% sure. But as I said earlier, you could look at the history of the polling firm. I'll name names. Okay, we can do that here.
Oh, I love names.
I love names.
Give her.
Forum Research.
Mm-hmm.
Forum Research in Toronto. Basically, they're not a partner of yours, right?
No.
They publish polls that are completely out of whack compared to the other pollsters. And so this sentence alone could say, well, maybe we're right and they're wrong. But basically, the pattern is always the same. Their polls just capture the headlines, because they're always outliers. And we don't take them seriously. And then the very last poll, just the day before the election or 2 days before the election, they will publish a poll that will actually look exactly like their competitors. And so that poll will just, what we call herding, what we call all the polls converging to a single point when we get to the election. They always do that. And so what I found out was in my research of Quebec elections, I get better results if I ignore forum research. So, but will I do it? Well, I work for L'Actualité and Radio-Canada and CTV now. So, I mean, I cannot ignore them, but I can choose what weight to give them in my model. And so since they're always, I don't want to say they're always wrong, because they're not, but they're always out of whack compared to the other pollsters, I can choose to reduce the weight of that polling firm. And that's a subjective argument that I'm making here, but it's based on data. It's based on past results.
So that's one thing that the public then can do, is in terms of when you're being presented with some sort of claim or statistical claim or poll, is to look at, well, who's telling me this and what's their history? I like even when you're touching on that, who's telling me this, because it leads to another thing, which is, does this person have an interest in convincing me of something? So who's doing the poll? Who actually did the study? Who actually did the polling? And do I think that they have a reason to try to? So if there's going to be a study that's released, or some poll released, or some study released that says that there's this strong relationship between drinking orange juice and longevity and sex appeal, let's say, and then I want to look at, that sounds great, but then who's actually publishing? Yeah. Who's actually doing the data?
Big orange.
Yeah, exactly. The Tropicana or something like that, or right after this is presented in the news, then up comes 3 Tropicana ads back to back, or Oasis or something like that. I'm not saying they're doing this sort of thing. I don't want to tarnish these businesses, but so we want to watch who the actual people are. So what's their history in terms of accuracy? Who are the people that are actually conducting the research is really important to know. And then what else would you suggest to people? So as consumers to make people of data, how can we make people more numerate?
Good luck.
Like if you can give your top 5 tips to people in terms of how to consume.
Always be suspicious of polls. Be even more suspicious of journalists who report on polls when they don't know nothing about polls. This is one of the. I remember when I was building my model, and I was just for my personal use at first. It was I shared it with friends. It was December 2016. There were 2 polls that month, and they were radically different. Léger showed a tie between the Liberals and the Parti Québécois, and Krupp 3-4 days later showed a 10-point lead for the Liberals. So those 2 polls taken together were radically different. And of course, commentators and media and Québécois media and all of them were just pulling their hairs out saying the polling industry is sick and blah, blah, blah. And then when you look at the average over a year, you see that's December 2016. The 2 polling firms went this way, so separated for 2 outliers, and then they just regressed to the mean the next month. So of course, if you're looking at 1 or 2 polls on 1 month, you will say these polls don't make any sense. But if you average them out over several weeks, several months, you look, okay, it was just noise.
So then you want people to
give as little importance to a single poll as possible.
So
to look at
the statistics of the polls.
Of course.
So you need to observe the observers. So by observing the observers, you have statistics of the observations of the observers.
Goldwater, aggregators of aggregators. There you go.
Well, because that's, it's like when we learn in school sort of statistics 101, you have 100 coffee jars and they're supposed to have 10 ounces of coffee each. Let's measure the coffee. And you realize some jars have 9 ounces and some jars have 11 ounces and it should average out to the 10 ounces, right? So, but what you're saying, you're essentially saying the same thing, but instead of coffee in coffee jars, you're talking about the polls. Well, see, you make me think of ratings on Amazon. If I'm going to go buy what's something pretty, a highlighter, a brand of highlighters on Amazon, I'm going to look for the brand of highlighters that has the most reviews and look at their rating. And I read the rating to have an idea if the reviewers are legitimate. And then I'll buy I'll buy the highlighter of the company that has the most reviews. Why would a federal government agency, never Quebec, the federal government agency, shouldn't it have a permanent department wherein it reports in a publicly available website the track record of the different polling firms? So if you happen to be reading Le Presse or Le Devoir, and you sit and you read and you say, Léger has announced a new poll, you can scoot over and look at your government website and see, well, what is Léger's track record? Because otherwise we have no way of measuring it.
Government website. You look at my website. That's exactly what I do. What you just described. This is exactly what I do. If you go on Quebec125.com, I list all the polls and I aggregate and I keep track of all their polling reports, because a poll without a report, I don't use them. Right? Some polling firm says we have this news article, let's say, in the Toronto Sun or something. Mm-hmm. And, what's the report? Well, it's not ready yet. Well, I don't use it then. So I have to see the full report.
Why Quebec125.com? 125 must have some great significance.
Yeah, 125 ridings in Quebec.
Local politics.
It's pretty good. Well, I started it. Well, it's Quebec125.com existed because everybody called it Quebec125. It was QC125, but now I'm making money off it now. So of course I'm going to go on and do other provinces and the federal government.
Well, why don't you go and do the states? They're the ones that we have to reform.
Oh, I will.
So that takes us to how do we elect? We don't really need elections conducted of the entire population.
Oh,
anymore.
We do.
No, we don't. If you believe there is any science in what you're saying, and that's what I'm going to test you on, because I listen, and I presume an astrophysicist actually is invested in objectivity, science, and rationality.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Then you know that technically we don't need to vote the entire population. That's not necessarily an accurate snapshot, because not everybody can get out to vote. You're not getting a representative sample, because you're just getting the sample of the people on that particular day.
Who actually vote.
Who remember, who are able to go. If there's no snowstorm that day, if it's not 35 degrees outside, Celsius, not Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
For American listeners, right? And it's as we say, you have to aggregate all the factors that prevent people from voting, because nowadays fewer and fewer people vote to begin with. So you're getting a very skewed sample of the electorate. You're not getting a fair sample.
Very skewed sample. You have to be careful with semantics here. Last Quebec election, 71% of eligible adults voted. 71% of the population, that's not a skewed sample. That's pretty big.
But that being said, what would be a more valid way, thinking of our poor neighbors to the south, and in all fairness to them, they're suffering. They're suffering, and it's suffering that's being spread and being inflicted on people in Canada, on babies in Mexico. You know, it's suffering that's spreading all over the world. If you believe in the objectivity and the rationality of what you're doing, what would you propose would be a better methodology if we still believe in democracy, and maybe we shouldn't, because they don't get 71% of the population out? And that would give us a more representative sample so that you don't have just the haters coming out to vote. Like we see on social media, it's the most aggressive, volatile people who actually come out and make their presence felt on social media.
They go after me too. You know, don't. Yeah, I know. Listen, 15 minutes ago you were denouncing how the U.S. now got a autocratic leader, right? Mm-hmm. Well, now you're questioning whether we need to vote. There's a contradiction here.
No, it's the methodology of the execution of democratic values.
I would love to be able to vote with my phone. But then not everybody has this. Not everybody has access to a phone.
You really think not every... How many cell phones are on the earth now? Out of a population, 7 billion?
Well, I think voting on the phone would be great, assuming that you can't, assuming that you don't hack it.
People would hack it,
yeah,
of course.
Which would be the bigger issue.
It's really hard to hack a piece of paper which you put a cross in it, right? That's why we still keep this method of counting votes.
That's one of the jokes I've read about that one of the best ways to keep your password is actually on a piece of paper, like in your wallet or in your desk or something like that, because every other way could be hacked or stolen.
True.
The best way to I think our democracy is not as bad as you claim it to be. I think 70% of people voted in Quebec, and in the federal government, I think it was 68 to 69%. So, I mean, about a third of the population doesn't vote, and I guess it's their choice for most of them. That's too bad. I wish more people voted.
So then I think that there's, I think we touched on some really important points, that there's, that polling and collecting data can give us some valuable, just a snapshot or a reasonable predictor in terms of where things are going politically. And that there's obviously certain limitations to that to watch out for. And I think, some of the important things that as consumers of data and of statistics is to be able to look for, okay, who is communicating this, so do I think that the agency has a vested interest or not in terms of who's conducting the polling? What's their track record? And of course, to go and to weight kind of bigger studies or aggregate polls more strongly, especially anything that's from Quebec125.com. Does that more or less sum up where we're at?
Yes, I think so. There was a point that I'd like to add.
Sure.
Some people say, well, we should get rid of political polling, especially during a campaign. You've heard this before, I'm sure, right?
Especially in Canada, where we actually have limitations. Because the closer you are to the election date, they're supposed to be in use blackout, in the last 24 hours?
Well, yeah, 24 hours, that's right. But so again, I'm going to quote Dr. Durand of Université de Montréal, because she told me the story of in Tunisia, there was a few years ago an election, and the government forbid polls during the campaign. It was about maybe a 2-month campaign. And basically what happened? The polls still occurred. And we could not differentiate between legitimate polls and garbage numbers that were spewed out by partisans. And so we had no way of verifying or taking into account which were the real numbers and which were the false numbers. And so now those polling firms in Canada and Quebec, they have to publish a full report with their polls, and they have to do it in a time frame that's set by the government. So 24 hours before. And so once their final numbers are in, let's say they're 10 points off the mark, they will lose money. They will lose credibility. They will lose a part of their reputation. So that's big. There's a price to pay if you poll and you're wrong. And that's
okay, but that's the Canadian solution. The Canadian solution is to have a degree of government regulation.
Yes,
to try
very small.
a small degree, but enough to give some tools to the population to be able to gauge the legitimacy of the poll, which was Samantha's question to begin with.
Yes.
And now when you say on your site, for instance, you give the track records of the polling agencies, do you also disclose their vested interest, for instance, the sponsors of different polls?
Yes. Well, they have to. They have to publish it. So if they have to publish who paid for the polls. Sometimes it's just themselves. Like the last Main Street research was just, we want to do a poll, and we will publish it on our website, hoping to get some traffic. But if someone commissions the poll, they have to reveal it.
Now, if your methodology is so good and you're able to craft criteria to decide your sample size and how are you going to have representativity in your sample, and, you know, like Samantha, you had when you were doing your study for your doctorate, you had to be sure you had a certain representativity in the sample that you were selecting, and there's a lot of methodology and science behind that. Instead of taking for granted that there's always going to be a subgroup of the population that doesn't vote, and I think it would be sad to take that for granted, to say that because for whatever reason they fail to exercise their franchise, they become disenfranchised par le fait même, by the fact of failing to get out there. And if you believe in a true democracy where you really want to know what the whole population is thinking, wouldn't it make sense to use the science you've developed to craft a sample? Say, how many people are in Quebec? 8 million people?
Yeah, 8.5, yeah.
It should be enough to craft a sample of, say, 3,000 people. Right?
Okay.
Right? That
Go
would
on.
be sufficient. And where you make sure to have representativity by using demographic data and census results. I took notes when you were saying that's how you do the crafting.
Right.
So, you know, you have to have representation of minority groups and ratios for men and women and old and young and so on. And then select that sample size that you know is representative of 100% of the population of Quebec. And then do a long interview to know what policies they like and what leaders they want.
How much money do you have there? Because that's a limitation of polling. If a poll had 100,000 people, you could nail down elections to the decimal number. But who has that kind of money? Polls
but doesn't it cost
money.
a lot to create how much does it cost to run a general election?
The cost of democracy, you mean?
Yeah, the cost of democracy. It's still saying that 8 million fools can make just as bad a choice as one fool. So it doesn't mean we like it because we do it. Doesn't mean there's a lot of science behind it.
I was following you there. I just didn't know where you were going.
I don't understand. Why would we subject 8 million people to a general election with all the dangers of hacking, with the recognition that maybe 3 million out of 8 million people aren't going to vote to begin with, and instead just say we're going to take a sample of 3,000 people with representativity and sit down with them, even with individual interviews if you have to.
And set our government according to the 3,000 people?
Scientifically just as valid.
Nope, because, but there's uncertainty. That's the thing. If you're looking for perfection and precision, polling is not for you. Polling is uncertain.
But it might be a better outcome than the vagaries of the general election. And skip the campaigns.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the campaigns we need to skip.
Where's the fun in there then? That would put
It's a
me out of
huge
business.
cost to society, the stupidity of the campaigns and the false messages that are propagated and the nativism and the populism and the divisiveness. You remember our last election?
I do.
You remember what the Parti Québécois was trying to do at that time?
And I remember them losing badly too.
Yeah, it's not the party of René Lévesque, that's for sure.
And I remember also a year later, Stephen Harper going for the same campaign of going after, Muslim veiled women and stuff like that during the immigration.
It wasn't a winning recipe.
The PQ tried it, they lost, and then the Conservatives tried it and they lost. So,
but the CAQ is trying it, and they might get in.
Well,
that's the difference. It's
campaign
not always logical.
The campaign hasn't started.
Yeah, but the idea is taking hold, this divisiveness.
Would you like to make a bet?
What's the bet? I might take you on that bet.
Who would win the next election? Who's going to win in October 1st? According to you, to your instinct. You have instinct, right?
No, I don't have instincts.
Oh.
I have instincts, but I recognize that
they're need instinct in a courtroom.
They're full of bias or full of noise.
They're full of signal noise and bias. Who do I think is going to win? Unfortunately, I think the CAQ. Couillard, for some reason, is not as popular. And I think the wrong person's going to win. I think François Legault is going to win.
And what do you base that on? What do you base that on?
Polls.
Well, let me ask.
Got
Based on actual.
He got me. Oh my God! I just lost this debate.
My work is done here. It was fun to meet you all. Thank you.
Yeah, Philippe, seriously, thank you so much for the discussion today. And you know what? And we'll just see what the results are. We'll see, Mom, if your if your aggregate opinion based on the polls, if your opinion based on the aggregation of the polls is actually accurate. And of course, we'll check out Quebec125.com to see if Philippe makes a better prediction.
By then. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
C'était un plaisir.
It seemed like Philippe convinced you at the end there that there is some validity to political polling.
Well, clearly he's done his homework, and he is relying on other independent studies that indicate that the reporting of polling does not, in fact, change people's individual polling intentions. In fact, that people vote for the character that they like the best, and that's it, and very little sways them. And in fact, the only thing that really appears to sway public opinion is energetic and persuasive campaigning, which is quite different from what we might have expected, which is the fact of listening to poll results might affect your perception of whether your favorite candidate is a winner or a loser. You know, people tend to flock to the one they perceive to be the winner. So that was certainly an important element. And in addition, he made it very clear that he applies intellectual rigor to the development of his sampling and his methodology. And I don't want to make it sound like because I have a background in math, I was impressed. But yeah, I do have a background in math. In fact, I started a master's in math. And math and computer science have always been my favorite subjects. Don't ask me why I became a lawyer. I see myself more appropriately in the halls of academia than in courtroom corridors. But, you know, that's life. But anybody who is interested in working with rigor with his numbers and actually understands the numbers then impresses me as the real McCoy. Maybe I was a little unfair to Philippe at the beginning because, you know, in Quebec, there's quite a strong anti-scientific bias that sort of afflicts a lot of the domains of sociology, including political thinking. And I wondered, and let's say I was testing whether I was just running into some local yokel who was just trying to make use of data, whether he understood it or not, for the sake of his own political or economic gain. And he certainly corrected this false impression quite rapidly. And I was very pleased he was able to hold his own, because not everybody can when I start cross-examining.
Maybe the first guest on the podcast to have you bend a little bit on an opinion. I can't recall another one where you
he got to me. That's terrible. Maybe because he's cute. I don't know. No, but no, seriously, I'm always impressed by intelligence. It's the one thing I crave in a debate, is a different opinion that's intelligent and it can sway me. And, you know, there are some very nice judges out there who'll say that. They will say at the beginning of an argument by a lawyer, say, listen, you know, I'm looking at the facts. Convince me, Metro Goldwater, that your way of looking at the facts is valid and I should run with it. And those are the judges I love the best, the ones who come in with an open mind, and they may have an impression because they've now heard evidence and they want to hear how I reason it out. So this was that type of guy, the type of guy who is ready to reason out and explain his methodology and how he approaches putting it together, the data, and validating or invalidating what he's studying. So it seems to him to be a passion project more than just a job.
So how to help us make sense of data and of polling, do you have a further reading recommendation?
I have an absolutely mandatory book that is hugely inexpensive, and it's a book called Innumeracy, Mathematical Illiteracy and Its Consequences. It's a book written by John Allen Paulus, Paulos, and it costs in hardcover, all of $25, and you can probably buy it in paperback for under $10. And it's organized into a number of very easy to read chapters that teach you to think more critically anytime you hear percentages or numbers or you see a graph in the newspaper, so you can understand how partisan thinkers can manipulate you with numbers and statistics. Statistics are hugely important. They're the foundation of our understanding of the world around us. But unless you understand what the numbers mean and how they're being presented to you, they can also be used to manipulate your thinking and distract you from the truth instead of leading you to the truth. So a super easy to read book. It's so entertaining. You're going to laugh at me. I bought it twice.
Thanks, Anne France.
You're welcome.
Don't forget, you can listen to past episodes of The Goldwaters at thegoldwaters.ca and join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter with the hashtag TheGoldwaters. And email us if there's something that you want to chat about or something that you believe the Goldwaters should examine. Our email address is talk@thegoldwaters.ca. I'm Dan Delmar. Until next time.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.